The sound in the Mayflower Hotel's grand ballroom wasn't the kind of noise you usually heard at political dinners. It wasn't the booming, confident hum of donors congratulating themselves over champagne flutes or the raucous laughter of backslapping senators. No, this was something else. It was the soft, layered murmur of people who knew they were about to see something worth remembering. Every fork clink against china was deliberate. Every whisper carried the weight of speculation. The chandeliers overhead didn't just illuminate the room, they caught every movement, every flicker of expression, trapping it in a golden spotlight. In the center of it all, under the massive crystal centerpiece that glimmered like a frozen waterfall, Melania Trump sat at the head table. Her posture was immaculate, the kind of elegance that came from years of being watched, analyzed, and judged. She wasn't talking much, just offering the occasional nod or carefully measured smile to the dignitaries flanking her. Beside her, a glass of still water sat untouched, condensation trailing down its side like a bead of sweat under pressure. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett was already leaning forward in her chair, her chin tilted slightly upward, as though she'd been born to sit under this kind of light. The Texas Congresswoman's eyes flicked from person to person, scanning the terrain, reading the room the way a seasoned trial lawyer reads a jury. She wasn't dressed to blend in. She wasn't dressed to disappear. She was dressed to be remembered. A deep emerald green that seemed to challenge the gilded room around her. The evening had been proceeding according to script, speeches about unity, carefully crafted platitudes about bipartisanship, a charity auction that felt more like a flex of influence than altruism. But the undercurrent was there, undeniable. You could feel it in the way people lingered on their words, in the pauses that stretched a little too long. Something was brewing, and everyone could sense it without knowing what it was. When the time came for the fireside conversation between the First Lady and Congresswoman Crockett, a polite euphemism for a public exchange staged under the pretense of goodwill, the shift in the room was immediate. Aides subtly positioned themselves along the periphery, journalists adjusted the angles of their recorders and phones, and the guests leaned just slightly toward the stage. The air felt denser, charged. Melania began with that slow, deliberate cadence she favored, soft enough to seem gentle, measured enough to demand attention. "I believe," she said, her accent curling over the words, "that in these times, it is important for all of us, no matter our positions, to remember, tone matters. How we speak to each other matters. We can have disagreements, but we must always keep respect." It was delivered like a lesson. Not a suggestion. A lecture. And while some in the crowd nodded approvingly, others felt their stomachs twist. It was the kind of comment that wasn't just about civility, it was about control. Jasmine didn't look away. Not for a second. She let the words settle, the silence stretch, the room breathe in the tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, smooth, but it carried something underneath, a heat, a weight. "With all due respect, Madam First Lady," she began, "tone is important. But so is truth. And I've learned, both in the courtroom and in this very building, that sometimes telling the truth out loud, to power, doesn't sound sweet. It's not meant to. Sometimes the truth has an edge, because the realities people live through have edges. And if the people in positions of influence don't hear that edge, they can pretend those realities don't exist." You could hear the collective inhale of the room. The tension wasn't just between the two women, it had now wrapped itself around every guest like a second skin. A senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A lobbyist's grin froze halfway across his face. Somewhere near the back, the ice in someone's glass cracked loud enough to turn heads. Melania's smile didn't falter, but it hardened. "Yes," she replied, "truth is important. But there are ways to deliver it without attacking. Without making the other person feel diminished." And there it was. The subtle, sugar-coated rebuke. Delivered with a stillness that felt like it could shatter. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, but her eyes never softened. "Sometimes," she said, "the only people who feel diminished by truth are the ones who have benefited from silence." It wasn't just an answer, it was a scalpel. And you could feel the slice travel through the room. At that moment, I thought about how many people in that ballroom had been waiting for something like this, whether they'd admit it or not. Not the charity pledges, not the speeches, they were here for a flash of authenticity, for the moment the scripted veneer cracked and you saw what was really underneath. That's why we watch, why we listen, why we lean in when the air feels heavier than it should. And if you're leaning in right now, you're exactly the kind of person who belongs here. This is Narrative Nest, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because moments like this? They don't just happen. They unfold. And you're about to see how. Back at the head table, Melania's expression remained poised, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her napkin. Jasmine didn't gloat, didn't push, it wasn't about winning in that moment. It was about planting something, a truth that would grow, even if it was unwelcome. The moderator, sensing the rising voltage, quickly interjected with a softer question about bipartisan charity initiatives, trying to reset the tone. But the damage, or the brilliance, depending on your seat, was done. People weren't thinking about the charity auction anymore. They were thinking about the way Melania's words had been answered, the way Jasmine's composure hadn't cracked. Somewhere near the press section, a reporter was already drafting the headline in her mind. Not about the dinner. Not about the cause. But about the moment when the First Lady tried to teach a lesson in civility, and was handed a masterclass in speaking truth without ever raising her voice. And as the evening moved forward, the undercurrent remained. The polite applause, the tinkling glasses, the carefully exchanged pleasantries, all of it was just the surface. Underneath, the ripples of what had just happened were already spreading. By the next morning, the Mayflower's crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors were just a memory, but the conversation that had taken place beneath them was anything but forgotten. Washington wakes up fast, but on mornings like this, it feels like the city doesn't sleep at all. The first wave hit before the sun had even burned through the thin August haze. News alerts began lighting up phones in every office from Capitol Hill to K Street. The headlines varied, each with its own slant. Melania Trump urges civility at gala, Representative Crockett fires back, First Lady's tone lecture sparks viral exchange, Congresswoman stuns room with response to Melania. Cable news producers live for clips like this, short, clean bursts of conflict that can loop endlessly between talking heads. Within hours, the exchange was playing in split screen on morning shows, Melania on one side, Jasmine on the other, the captions doing their best to stoke the flame. In a quiet townhouse in Georgetown, a media strategist for a prominent conservative PAC watched the footage for the fifth time, her coffee going cold. She'd been in the room the night before, close enough to see the subtle tightening of Melania's jaw, the calculated restraint in Jasmine's voice. She knew both women had walked away with exactly what they wanted. Melania had reaffirmed her role as the dignified guardian of decorum. Jasmine had shown she could hold her ground against one of the most scrutinized women in America, and make it look effortless. But politics isn't just about what you say. It's about who says it first the next morning. Over on the other side of the city, Jasmine Crockett's chief of staff, Marcus Reyes, was already fielding calls. "They're asking if you'll go on morning line," he said, phone wedged between his ear and shoulder as he scanned a list of other requests. "They want the soundbite, Jazz. They want you to say exactly what you said last night, but sharper." Jasmine sipped her tea, not looking up from the documents spread in front of her. "We're not sharpening," she said. "We're clarifying. There's a difference." Marcus knew what that meant. No wild swings. No gloating. Just the same steady composure she'd shown in the ballroom, even as the temperature in the room rose. Still, the pressure was building. She could feel it. Across town, Melania's team was holding their own meeting in the East Wing. The mood was controlled but tense. The First Lady had been through media storms before, brutal ones, but this was different. This wasn't gossip about her wardrobe or speculation about her private life. This was a direct challenge, on a public stage, from a sitting member of Congress. "She was disrespectful," one aide said, his voice tight with indignation. "We can't let that stand without a response." Melania raised her hand slightly, silencing him. "It is not about her," she said, her voice calm but edged. "It is about the message. We must keep our dignity. I will not be dragged into a fight in the mud." Still, her fingers drummed once against the polished table before going still again. By mid-afternoon, the exchange had taken on a life of its own. Social media wasn't just talking about the moment, it was dissecting it, memeing it, and weaponizing it. A slow-motion clip of Jasmine saying, "The only people who feel diminished by truth are the ones who have benefited from silence," had racked up millions of views on X, Instagram, and TikTok, set to everything from dramatic orchestral swells to hip-hop beats. It was no longer just a political story. It was entertainment. But inside the Beltway, entertainment can be dangerous. Every viral moment changes the way power moves, shifts allegiances, and draws new battle lines. For every person praising Jasmine's candor, there was another quietly warning that she'd made a powerful enemy. And for every ally Melania had reassuring her she'd done the right thing, there was someone whispering that the moment made her look rattled, whether she was or not. That night, Jasmine sat alone in her DC apartment, city lights bleeding in through the window. The phone on her desk buzzed with yet another media request, but she let it go to voicemail. She wasn't thinking about interviews. She was thinking about something her grandmother used to say back in Dallas: "When you speak truth to power, don't expect power to thank you for it." She smiled faintly. The truth had been spoken. Now came the part no one saw, the part where the echo of your words could either open doors, or slam them shut. And somewhere, in a room just as quiet but miles away, Melania Trump sat beneath the glow of a single lamp, watching the clip again. Not in anger. Not even in frustration. But with a calculating stillness. Because for all the chatter, she knew one thing: this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The city was breathing faster now. Not the literal streets and monuments of Washington, but the network of conversations that pulsed through it, hallways in the Capitol, backrooms in steakhouse basements, the encrypted group chats that kept friendships and rivalries simmering long past sunset. The Melania Crockett exchange wasn't just a talking point anymore. It was a litmus test. 2 days after the gala, a closed-door meeting was underway on the 4th floor of a boutique hotel just off DuPont Circle. The space smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old leather, and the windows had been covered with blackout curtains. It was the kind of room designed for people who wanted to be unseen. Marcus Reyes sat at the head of the table, flanked by Jasmine's communications director and 2 trusted political operatives who'd flown in from Texas overnight. On the far end, a young aide was running through a list of committee members whose support could be solidified, or lost, depending on how Jasmine handled the next week. "They're circling," Marcus said, his voice low. "Not all of them are hostile, but they're waiting to see if she overplays her hand. If she looks vindictive, she loses the high ground." "What about the town hall next Thursday?" one operative asked. "It's already on the calendar. Local press will be there. National press will sniff it out the moment they smell blood." Marcus leaned back. "She goes. She speaks. And she doesn't take the bait." But he knew, deep down, that bait wasn't something you could always avoid. Sometimes it found you. Across the river, in a guarded compound in Northern Virginia, another meeting was unfolding, Melania's inner circle, tighter and far more insulated. The East Wing had its formal staff, but this was something different. Friends who had been with her before politics. Allies with long memories and deep pockets. One of them, a silver-haired man with a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "You have an opportunity here," he said. "Don't make this about defending yourself. Make it about protecting something bigger: civility, respect, tradition. Let her be the one who looks combative." Melania listened, expression unreadable. She understood better than most that perception was currency in this town. You didn't need to win arguments. You needed to win the narrative. And if the narrative could be shaped into something grander than one exchange at a dinner table, it could last longer, reach further. The plan began to crystallize: a carefully staged public appearance, not an interview where she'd be cornered, but a platform she could control completely. That same night, while the city wound down, both women were still in motion. Jasmine, walking the quiet blocks near her apartment, phone pressed to her ear as she spoke to an old mentor in Dallas. Melania, seated at a desk in her private study, drafting the skeleton of a speech that would be delivered not as a rebuttal, but as a declaration. By morning, the pieces were in place. Jasmine's team was quietly leaking her schedule to select reporters, giving just enough of a trail to ensure the right eyes and ears would be present at that Thursday town hall. Melania's team had locked in an event at the National Museum of American History, a gala on American unity that would bring in press from every major outlet. For the first time since the Mayflower dinner, their paths were set to cross publicly. Not in the same room, not yet, but in the same news cycle. The city's political journalists could smell it. 2 speeches, 2 stages, same day. There would be no avoiding comparisons. No dodging the subtext. When Thursday came, the air in D.C. felt like a storm waiting to break. Jasmine's town hall was standing room only, the crowd a mix of her loyal base and curious onlookers drawn by the viral moment. She took the stage in a deep cobalt blazer, her expression calm, her voice steady. She didn't mention Melania by name. She didn't have to. Every reference to "those who confuse politeness with silence" landed like a stone skipping across water, rippling further each time. Across town, Melania stepped into the museum's grand hall wearing a cream-colored gown that caught the light like porcelain. The speech was polished, deliberate, and heavy with phrases about restoring dignity in public life and rejecting the theater of outrage. Her audience, business leaders, diplomats, and a front row of cameras, soaked it in. By nightfall, the 2 events were being spliced together on cable news, one clip dissolving into the next, as pundits debated whose message resonated more. Online, the discourse had turned into open combat. Hashtags for each woman trended side by side, sometimes colliding in the same tweet. And in that collision, something shifted. This wasn't just a political spat anymore. It had become a contest of endurance, one that would test not just who could land the sharper line, but who could withstand the weight of the fight itself. Somewhere deep inside both camps, the unspoken realization was dawning: neither of them was going to back down. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening for the city's power class, the annual Voices for Change benefit, a glittering fundraiser tucked inside the sleek marble atrium of the Conrad Hotel. The guest list read like a who's who of Washington politics, media, and culture. Both women were invited, but no one expected they'd actually overlap. Not after the week they just had. The lobby smelled faintly of peonies and expensive perfume. Waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through clusters of guests, balancing trays of champagne flutes that shimmered under the chandelier's gold light. Somewhere, a jazz trio was playing a slow, deliberate version of Autumn Leaves. Jasmine arrived first, in a sharply tailored black jumpsuit, her hair swept up, every inch of her posture radiating calm control. She worked the room slowly, pausing for photos, exchanging quick handshakes and longer, quieter conversations in the corners. 20 minutes later, a ripple passed through the crowd, a subtle change in pitch, like air pressure shifting before a storm. Melania had entered. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had no need to announce herself. The ivory silk of her dress caught every flicker of light, and her eyes scanned the space not with surprise, but calculation. They saw each other at almost the same moment. There was a pause, the kind that swallows sound, before they began moving. Not directly toward one another, but on a slow, invisible arc that would inevitably meet. By the time they closed the distance, the hum of the room had lowered just enough for the people nearby to sense that something was happening. The jazz trio kept playing, but their notes seemed thinner now, like the melody was holding its breath. Congresswoman Crockett, Melania said first, her accent soft but deliberate. The faintest trace of a smile curved her lips. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine replied, her voice warm enough to be polite, cool enough to be unmistakably formal. For a moment, neither said more. The pause was not awkward, it was surgical, each measuring the other's composure. I trust you've been well, Melania said, tilting her head slightly. As well as anyone under the circumstances, Jasmine replied. The city's been lively. Melania's eyes flickered, a half-second narrowing, quickly masked. It's important to remember, she said slowly, that in public life, tone can lift a conversation, or destroy it. Jasmine didn't blink. Tone is a tool, she said. But it's not a shield. Sometimes, truth doesn't come gift-wrapped. A couple standing nearby suddenly discovered a great interest in their wine glasses. Melania's smile tightened, but she didn't retreat. There is a difference between truth and spectacle. And there's a difference, Jasmine said, her voice dropping just enough that only the closest few could hear, between civility and silence. The words landed. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the quiet finality of a gavel strike. For a beat, the two women simply stood there, holding each other's gaze. In that stillness, there was no shouting, no breaking composure, only the knowledge that the conversation had drawn blood without anyone raising their voice. Melania inclined her head just slightly, as if acknowledging a chess move she hadn't predicted. Enjoy the evening, Congresswoman, she said, and with that, she turned, disappearing back into the current of guests. Jasmine stayed where she was, sipping her champagne, the faint hum of adrenaline still under her skin. She didn't look around to see who had been watching. She already knew. In a room like this, nothing happened without witnesses. By the time the event ended, snippets of their exchange had already begun to drift through text messages and whispered recaps. No one quoted it exactly, but everyone agreed on one thing, neither woman had given an inch. And in Washington, that kind of standoff wasn't an ending. It was an opening act. The city was restless that night. A storm had been moving in all afternoon, flattening the air and drawing a heavy, electric stillness over Washington. By nightfall, the rain came hard and fast, blurring the monuments into ghostly shapes against the dark. Inside the cavernous hall of the Kennedy Center, the air was thick with perfume, camera flashes, and the rustle of silk gowns. It was the annual Civic Honors Gala, a carefully choreographed mix of tribute and networking, broadcast live to millions. Both women had been invited. Neither had intended to acknowledge the other. But fate, or perhaps the organizers, had other plans. The seating chart placed them at the same table, a sleek round set near the stage, under the direct eye of the cameras. When Jasmine saw the name card beside hers, she let out a low exhale that was almost a laugh. Melania, arriving moments later, didn't so much as blink when she saw it. She simply pulled back her chair, smoothing her dress, and sat. The host's voice echoed over the sound system, the evening's honorees already being introduced. Applause rose and fell in waves. But at table 7, the real performance was silent, a careful game of posture, glances, and calculated timing. Halfway through the dinner, the inevitable happened. A moderator stepped to the podium and invited select guests to share brief words on unity in public discourse. The spotlight shifted, literally, until it fell on Melania. She stood with the ease of someone who had been handed a microphone her whole life. Her speech was smooth, almost too smooth. She spoke of dignity, grace, the need for leaders to rise above pettiness. She never mentioned Jasmine's name, but every example she gave felt close enough to draw blood. In times of division, she said, we must remember that how we speak is as important as what we say. The applause was polite, even warm. When she sat down, she angled her chair slightly toward Jasmine. Your turn, Congresswoman, she said softly. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. Jasmine rose slowly, adjusting the microphone to her height. She began without notes. Tone, she said, letting the word hang, is a beautiful thing when it's used to comfort the powerless. But when it's used to shield the powerful from accountability, it's just another way to tell people to be quiet. There was a subtle shift in the room. Not dramatic, but enough, a tightening of attention. I was taught, she continued, that the truth doesn't need to be polished to be real. That sometimes it comes out rough, sometimes it comes out loud, and that's not a failure of civility, that's a refusal to lie about the world we live in. The applause began before she even finished the sentence. It wasn't explosive, yet, but it had a different quality from the earlier one. Less dutiful, more alive. Then, with a precision that felt almost surgical, she turned toward Melania. And if speaking that truth makes some uncomfortable, maybe the discomfort isn't the problem. Maybe it's the point. This time, the applause was explosive. Cameras caught every flicker, Melania's stillness, the faint tightening of her jaw, the exact angle of Jasmine's gaze. The moderator tried to smooth it over with a quick thank you, but the damage was done. In living rooms across the country, people weren't talking about the award winners anymore. They were replaying those 30 seconds, frame by frame. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat, her phone was buzzing in her clutch, reporters, aides, friends, strangers. Melania didn't look at her, but she didn't need to. She knew exactly what had just happened. When the gala ended, the two women walked out into the rain through separate doors. Neither carried an umbrella. Neither looked back. And somewhere, in the quiet between the streetlights, it was clear to anyone paying attention, this was not the end of their story. It was just the moment the whole country decided to start watching. If you want the rest of this saga, and the stories they don't want you to hear, you know what to do. Subscribe now, and be here when the next chapter breaks.